Lovely. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this session this afternoon. Just a quick word about the English Association. We're a learned society and a subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support and defend the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, through to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to Matt and to Joe and to Stephanie. Our members also make it possible for us to deliver these events by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £53 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Right, that's enough from me. So I'm going to hand over now to Matt, who is going to kick off this afternoon's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. That's great. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about what is, you will no doubt be intrigued by such an enormous title as the one that was that we put together. So the way that we're going to run the session today is that we've got myself and two brilliant panelists that are going to join the discussion. And what we'd like to do is sort of set our stall out, if you like, for 5 to 7 minutes. And then when we've each finished speaking, we'll then create a space for there to be some questions and dialogue and discussion. And I think what I know that Steph and Joe and I are really keen to get your questions. So if you're kind of listening to one of us speak and there's a question that pops into your mind, please just do start typing it out. Becky is going to be checking the chat for us so that we can kick off with questions as we move through. So having said all of that, I think what might be really nice before we start is to do a brief introduction, so a 30-second introduction from each of us as panelists. So, Steph, without wanting to put you too much on the spot, can I come to you first? Would you give us an introduction to who are you?
Yeah, another really huge question, but I'll just stick to the work side of that to spare everybody. So I'm Steph Keenan. I'm currently head of programme for secondary English for English Mastery, which is an Art Curriculum Plus programme. And Art Curriculum Plus work with ART, which is a multi-academy trust, to provide their curriculum programmes for English, maths, science and geography. And they've done some primary programmes. We've got an English primary programme in pilot at the moment, and they've worked with Oxford University Press as well. So my interest is very much, curriculum design and student enjoyment, progression, love of English, all of those things. And my background before that was, I worked in television for about 11 years, television production. Then I did my PGCE when my kids were 2 and 4, which was a little bit full on. And then I was a teacher and, then head of department, the usual route in English, third, second, head of department, whole school literacy, whole school curriculum, and then saw the job come up at Art Curriculum Plus and thought, well, there's a great opportunity to join as Becky was saying, to join the conversation really about curriculum and English.
Great, thanks, Steph. Lots of expertise to bring to this discussion. Joe, who are you?
That's a very good question, Matt. I'm not sure I've got the answers. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. My name's Joe Barber. I was 14 years an English teacher in secondary and sixth forms until 2015, when I went to work at Manchester Metropolitan University as the course leader for the English secondary PGCE, and I'm still the course leader for that particular programme. And I'm also a unit lead for the whole of the PGCE across all subjects, trying to get students to explore subject pedagogy and kind of using the work of somebody like Lee Shulman, trying to get them to think about how they take their kind of raw material of their subject knowledge and turn that into subject pedagogy. So that occupies quite a lot of my time at work as well. And that all came together quite nicely in my doctorate, which I recently completed, and that in fact looked at what we're going to be talking about this evening, or related to this evening, which is what happens to PGCE secondary English students' knowledge of literary theory and literary criticism once they embark upon their PGCE studies. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all of it, really, Matt.
Great, thanks, Joe. And to finish off the Three Musketeers paneling today is myself, Matt Carnaby. I've been a long-suffering English teacher for well over a decade, and have, for the last 5 or 6 years been working on curriculum and assessment across multi-academy trusts, both in English and across a range of subjects. And also worked with the Department for Education on the reading framework too. I helped co-author that document, which is non-statutory guidance for the support of reading across key stages. Right, with no further ado, we're gonna dive in with some of our kind of opening statements. And if it's all right with everybody else, I think I'll just jump in first of all, because actually the whole premise of the discussion today was formed from a discussion Joe and I were having at the end of, I think, a committee meeting at the English Association about, well, what does it mean to be a reader? And it was thoroughly enthralling. And so I'm really pleased to add to Joe's expertise, Steph's expertise as well, to really unpick this question. So I'll begin. So I think I'm really clear that actually we could approach that question from lots of different angles. You could look at it when thinking about early reading or phonics. But I think what I'm really interested in, and what I'm planning to speak about here, is what hides behind, or in fact beyond, phonics, that messiness of what makes somebody a reader beyond phonic awareness. And I think I'm going to kind of lean on a bit of a curriculum lens to do that. So I think a reader to me is probably, when I reflect on that question, probably 2 things, I think, to me, if I was to lay my stall out. I think, firstly, a reader is somebody that is in tune with stories and narrative. I was really interested in my preparation for this that Mary Myatt was tweeting out this weekend, about talking about how we know that we know more and remember more if we hear new information in a story. And I was really interested she was tweeting that out just at this weekend, when I was thinking about this and thinking, well, actually, that is a reader, isn't it? Someone that's in tune with story and narrative and what that means. This allows us, I feel, to build knowledge, the knowledge we need to understand that craft of stories. So that is to say, the stuff that writers use when creating characters and narrative, that if we're in tune with stories and narrative, that helps us understand some of the tools that are being used. And I think there's nothing that strikes me more, actually, thinking about those tools of the craft, than my own children, 3 and 7, who every time we're reading certain books or watching certain television programs, they get to the, oh, I hate this bit, I can't watch. Every time there's that part where the problem is introduced, right? And they can't look at Frozen 2 or Frozen when they're first, these bits are happening, or it's a book they read. So I think it's that first part, is that a reader is somebody that's in tune with stories and narrative. I think also somebody that can develop individual interpretations of a new or unfamiliar text. You may be familiar with Mary Ann Wolf's Reader Come Home, but to quote her a little, I realised in a whiplash burst that those children, all mine for 1 year, might never reach their full potential as human beings if they never learnt to read. And Woolf captures it well, I think, that reading matters. It really matters. She says it matters to the individual, it matters emotionally, culturally, and educationally. Because of the economic impacts within society, it matters to everybody. And it's those 2 tenets that I'm going to kind of take forward in the rest of what I'd like to outline. Because for me, and I'm speaking personally now, I was none of those things when I was about 11 years old. And I started secondary school and was unable to read and write. And I was unable to access what Woolf calls, I love this, she calls it the language of books. It's that special vocabulary that children and expert readers like us rarely talk about, but exists, right? It's the character, theme, plot, narrative, convention, the breaking of convention. All of those things were alien, all were unfamiliar to me. And that made my primary education and my early secondary education particularly uncomfortable. Reading didn't matter to me at that time because I didn't feel as though reading was for me. I didn't have a voice, written or spoken, with which to engage in that language of books. I didn't find solace in poetry, as I would do in future, or understand myself better through the patchwork of characters that had problems like me. However, I remember vividly, and we've all got this story, I think, in year 9, that changed for me when I met Mr. Byrne. And we've all had that teacher, haven't we? He was particularly dishevelled, a mop of ginger hair that never looked like it had seen a comb, and a tie that had never seen the top button of a shirt, of an indeterminable age. Could have been late 20s, could have been late 40s. At that age, I had very little conception of what that might be. However, it was with students like me in that classroom that I became in tune with narratives. I connected to characters and conversations across time and came to know literature in a way that I had never done before. I understood that literature was a history. It was my history, a collection of conversation and discourse about life, its highs and its lows. And then began my love affair with literature and with books. One that I would take into my own classrooms, my own teacher education programs, curriculums, and groups of schools as a philosophy that was with me. If that serves as a little bit of a background to me and my interest in it, then for this session, and probably a lot more often, but probably less explicitly, kind of reflect on that process and what underpins it. How did I become a reader in that space? And I think I could capture it into sort of 3 strands for me. I think the first is that when I reflect on that, I think we should rightly first acknowledge our own expert blindness when we think about what it means to be a reader. Reading involves such a complex concoction of skill and knowledge that they're often indeterminable from one to another. I mean, sometimes it's really obvious, right? So to skim through a guide to Sorrento looking for recommendations for the best place to sample limoncello, it's fairly obvious what's happening. However, often what's happening and what's happening for our children is very hidden. For example, meeting Juliet for the first time and being posed with a question about how is she being presented? What's happening? Lots and lots of different things are happening, aren't they? And they're often hidden. Knowledge, so expert blindness. Knowledge, I feel, underpins skill and builds fluency and comprehension and frames the encounter with a text. And I don't just mean sort of a lazy knowledge-rich blanket saying, oh, you know, the way we teach literature is knowledge-rich, so therefore, you know, you can pre-teach everything. I don't think that, but I do think knowledge underpins lots of what's happening in those hidden spaces. And I mean a knowledge of language, or as Woolf calls it, that language of books, that literary knowledge. There is certain vocabulary that children aren't familiar with that is it's incumbent on us to teach them it. I think there's things like conceptual knowledge, not facts, but conceptual knowledge. And this is something that Joe and I have talked about a lot, like the concept of being a villain or being a hero, of love or power. An experience of different types of love, for example, that build across time. That concept is built through exposure to different examples. English is different to other subjects. It's kind of Michael Forden talks about it being a Frankenstein subject because it's a classroom-based subject. What is it? Well, it's actually lots of different things all coming together. And that's where some of that hiddenness of the skill and knowledge is actually implicit, because when I'm wrestling with the representation of Juliet, for example, if we stay with the same example, am I looking at a literary concept, or am I looking at something that we might define as extra literary knowledge? So things like religion, history, philosophy, politics, all of those things come to play and helps us to understand the nuance of a text, like serpent and it being associated with evil. That not necessarily a literary thing, maybe extra literary. So I think expert knowledge underpins skill and builds fluency comprehension. And then I think the third part is around there being a curated journey that children are taken through high quality examples of literature which build a reader's voice by being informed by other voices. And things like a teacher's clarity over what texts are being used in their classroom for readers. Is it reading for pleasure? Is it analysis? Is it reading for breadth? All require different approaches. Is it clarity over how we're using the text in the classroom for the reader? Is that teacher reading, student reading, reading the whole text at once, or reading extracts? And clarity over the tension between text selection and reading ability of the reader. Those things are all things that I think, for me, when I had Mr. Byrne, that he was holding in tension all of the time. So I would argue that's the journey I was taken on through those three key steps. However, we know that English as a classroom-based subject is contested. There isn't, very clearly, there isn't an easily agreed and limited body of knowledge which is required to understand or interpret literary texts. As Robert Eagleston suggests, it is about the walk, not the map. I like that. A notion that highlights that it's possible to know about a text that it isn't possible to know about a text by being provided just the background knowledge or context that's bolted onto the start to understand a text. And I would agree to that to a certain extent. You can't pre-teach everything in English teaching. It's much too vast. However, I would argue that we do need to build connections. The points on the map are the places of interest that we would want to take children, that would be interesting to all children, and build our readers' conceptual understanding of important ideas through literature through that process. Those ideas that writers have chosen to write about because they relate to the complex nature of being. I think it's without that deep understanding, we cannot hope to appreciate that walk, to appreciate how others have also struggled or strived for something more than they currently have, and to appreciate that shared history. So I think that's my 5 to 7 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, potted summary of my position, I think, on where I think a reader is. So on that note, Steph, can I hand over to you before then finishing with Jo for your statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things from what you said, Matt, which is I think that what emerges from your statement or story, if you like, is first of all, how intensely personal reading is. And everybody, like you said, everyone's got a story of that teacher. Everybody's got the story of how that book that woke them up, or that person that opened their eyes, or that personal journey. And I think that our story of reading is a story of itself. You know, the narrative that we have, our personal narrative, is always intertwined with the books that we've read and been introduced to. So I think that personal connection with the books we read, the people who introduce us to them, and also the state of being is really central. And I found it really hard to approach this question when I was asked, come and join this panel. And I was like, yeah, sure, panel, that'd be great. We'll just have a chat about reading. Sounds really good. And then Becky said, oh, but you've got to talk for 5 minutes yourself first on your own. I was like, but that's a huge question. I can't answer that in 5 minutes. Knowing that, just found out today that Jo's just published his doctorate. Didn't tell me that before they asked me to sign up to the panel. I can tell you. So I thought, okay, how am I going to deal with this? And I guess as one of the statements that I would make about reading is I think it makes you more able to be a writer, or attempt to be a writer. So the way that I tried to work out what I thought about this vast, limitless question was to try and write something. And I'll preface this by saying I had to fight my inner cringe quite a lot to write a poem, and all those inner voices. But I always say to my students, or would say to my students, I'll write with you. I'll write with you. I'm not embarrassed. I'll write with you, because I think if we're going to encourage kids to be writers, we have to make ourselves vulnerable as well. So I wrote a poem to try and work out what I thought. I'll read it to you, and I'll promise not to do my special poetry reading voice, but I'll read it to you. I was too embarrassed to send it to this lot in advance, because I know they're so super brainy, they might start analysing it. So I'm like, no, I'm going to read it first, and then I'll put it in the chat, and you can analyse it then. So yeah, I love the title had this throwaway little anyway at the end. So what is a reader anyway? And I felt like that gave me permission to have a play. You know, what is a reader? Oh God, I've got to have an answer. But what is a reader anyway? I'm like, oh, they want to play. That's great. That's great. So I went off and I wrote a poem. I'm going to silence my inner cringe, but I'll read it for you, and then I'll tell you what I think it helped me to work out about what I thought. So what is a reader? Anyway, a reader is an ocean in oneself, containing shifting tides and restless seas, vast multitudes from shelf to coastal shelf. Flooded by the lighthouse, a reader sees shores, suddenly connects the drifting grains, shared words, quartz, feldspar, mica, shell, fragments share resilience, seek common ground, beach or abyssal plains, while we, the oceans, hold our dissonance. Tides return to shore. We are what remains. Reader, come dive to the ancient of depths, down, deeper and down to the lithosphere. Reach the surface, dive free with all your breath. See what diversity of life is here. Dare you explore the Mariana Trench, navigate deeper than mountains are tall? Bold readers, come all. We oceans know pressure, at times immense, and sometimes we drift, sometimes are in thrall. But dive your own ocean, be ever in call. A reader needs anchors to give a sail. Moby Dick is moored by the Odyssey, tethered to the ancient mariner's tale, all links in chains towards wide Sargasso Sea. Writers are whispering through the ages. Books are ballast for life's tumbles and twists. Open our pages. Allow us to hold you when your seas shift. When life slips through hands and you burn from the rope, tectonic books stir tsunamis of hope. So readers have reasons to take to the waves. Who knows? We could be waving or drowning. Some might be cruising. Some need to be saved from full fathom 5 or the sea high running. Some read to the lighthouse. Some seek the pearl. Some can navigate, while some break. But let your sails unfurl. Reader, though storms be at your back, break free. Books are bounty. Break to new mutiny. Survivors, like the old man and the sea. Who are these coming to write with us now? Readers, sailing, braving fear of failing, critical voices and centuries of how writing has been, is and should be, hailing voices like theirs again and again. Time to share the power, join the conversation. Writers, it's time. Readers hear voices who make them feel brave. Readers are writers who take to the page. So that's my ode to reading. Thank you. I had such fun writing it. I can't tell you. So what I did, because I thought if I unpick how did I do that, you know, you talked about the sort of expert blind list. I'm not an expert poet. I'm a teacher who has a go. But like what I did was I thought I would like to write an ode to a reader. So who do I go to? Keats. Well, Keats, he's the odes guy, right? So I go to Keats and I think, well, what did I study for A level? It was ode to a Grecian urn, or was it on a Grecian urn? One or the other. And that's this sort of ode to this static thing. And he asks these deep and meaningful questions, and it gives us that lovely, you know, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, and that's all we need to know. But I thought, no, because a reader is active, you know, a reader is active. So we don't want this static artifact like we've talked about before. I think in terms of curriculum, there's a lot of artifacts in curriculum, but reading something to me which is very alive. And so I needed something huge and vast. So the ocean seemed to be a good starting point as that extended metaphor instead of the urn. And then, of course, in my head, having being quite old and having read quite a lot of books over the years, I've suddenly got all these other voices, you know, people who've written books about the sea, written poems about the sea, oceans, plays, Shakespeare, The Tempest, all these other voices come crowding in because I've been a reader for a really long time. And I thought, okay, so the way I thought it through, I suppose, by writing the poem, because it gave me a structure to work with, to kind of get this vast subject in order, was first of all this idea of us being an ocean in ourselves. So we're fluid and it's a potentially infinite space, like our own being or identity or humanity, you know, and that we're connecting shores somehow. I thought about that miserable Larkin line from, you know, misery deepening from in the coastal shelf or whatever it is, handing on misery to man. And I thought, no, Larkin, we're not going to hand on misery. Well, there can be misery in books. We're going to hand on books from our bookshelf, from our coastal shelf. so I thought about that, and then words, juicy words, as grains of sand, all the little bits of different things that make the sand, all from different places around the world, trying to connect and make sense. So that kind of fluid idea and that idea of connection was the first stanza. And then I thought, well, we're not just the ocean, we're a diver. We dive into books. I mean, I'm terrible. I kind of read them so fast I can never remember what happens, devour them. But yeah, we're divers too. We dive into books, but by diving into books, we're also exploring ourselves, because books are about that point of connection with ourselves. So we read to find ourselves, like that Maggie, Millie and Molly poem, the E. Cummings, whatever we find in the sea, there's always a you or a me. So that came to mind as well. So yeah, first of all, we're sort of fluid, infinite and seeking connection. Second of all, we're the diver as well as the ocean. We're exploring ourselves. And then I thought, well, how can I do this? How can I write this poem and have all these ideas? It's because I've just read a lot of books and people have taught me books over the years. So I thought, well, I'm building on what I've read before. And I thought about, us being moored by all these chains. And sometimes they can really hold us back, because I find it hard to write, because I know it will never be as good as what's gone before. So, you think, well, I won't try, because there's chains of all of the other writers are holding you back. But of course, that's your mooring, it's your ballast. It helps you, it gives you form. I was able to attempt an ode, roughly some sort of ode shape, because I'd learned about that. I'd read that before. So I guess that idea of building on others, intertextuality, entering into interesting relationships with text, authors, other writers, and that kind of idea of books as anchors or ballast or stability on our journey. And then why do we take to the waves? We were speaking before this chat about the personal reasons people always want a poem for a funeral. It's, reading is really emotional. And so we have reasons to take to those waves and pick up a book. And what we choose kind of is part of that journey that makes us who we are, by what we choose to read. And we can choose to accept or reject that. And then finally, I suppose the last stanza was about, I'd love all readers to also be writers, because why let everyone else have the page and the stage? The point of me for a teacher to introduce students to reading is that I would like them to be the next writer. So then the last thought really is that kind of call to arms. Don't be intimidated by the brilliance of some of those writers, but let them inspire you and be brave. And that's why I thought that line of readers are writers who take to the page is, that's one of my main purposes as a teacher. It would be not just to be reading, but reading hopefully is an inspiration to get writing. So that's why I tried to be brave myself and write the poem. So yeah, that's where I got to and how I got there. I thought otherwise I'd end up very bogged down in a lot of academic writing that I would never be able to summarize in 5 minutes. So hope that was enjoyable, and I'll put the poem in the chat now. I've read it. I know English teachers can be so brutal. I thought I'd better read it first.
Thanks for that, Steph. Really interesting approach to the question. And before I hand over to Joe, I think the two images that really stood out to me, and I'm sure stood out to you all listening as well, is that image of that every time we, as a reader, approach a new text, we take a history of characters and narratives with us that are on our back. That's the ocean. But then paired with that powerful image of being moored by chains, I really like that we're kind of rooted in a history of literature. Yeah, really powerful to me. Thank you for that. It takes me great pleasure then to hand over to Joe for his opening statement.
Thanks very much. And I mean, I'm terrified of following on from Matt and Steph. Just utterly inspiring, passionate and brilliant. And Steph, you'll have my respect to the end of time for reading aloud a poem that you wrote yourself, and it was really lovely. I also really love the fact that we're answering the same question in really quite different ways, I suppose, but with very similar concerns and priorities. And I hope that you can find those similarities in what I'm about to say, having heard all three of us talk to the question, what is a reader? That there are things there, in spite of our kind of different approaches to things, there are similar concerns and priorities. it's worth me saying to begin with then that sort of the broad context of my position and my response to the question really stems from an interest as a PGCE tutor who visits schools, lots of different schools in a year, possibly between 30 and 50 schools that I'll visit every year to observe, carry out observations of student teachers, and to talk to lots of English teachers about the progress that those student teachers are making. I've become very interested in whether secondary English teachers see themselves as teachers of reading and what that means, what their identities are about as teachers of reading across Key Stage 3 and 4. And I suppose for me in particular, I've become interested in this idea of critical literacy and the extent to which pupils across Key Stage 3 and 4 are invited to see themselves as readers who are capable of making meaning from what they read. Listening to Matt, I didn't intend to talk about this, but it was very moving, really, and it reminded me of how I came to be a reader and see myself as the kind of reader who chose to pursue English as a subject to study at university, and that was through an English teacher called Anique. And I'd returned to do resit English, having failed English at school. In fact, I failed everything at school. And as a resit student, slightly older than my peers, I was asked by her what I thought about the presentation of the perpetrators of the Lockerbie bombing. And it was taken from an article in The Sun. This was obviously in preparation for the GCSE English language exam. And when she asked me what I thought about the presentation of those perpetrators, I answered her with a question: what's that got to do with me? What I think? How does that fit into this situation at all? And I thought that firstly because at that point I thought that language was neutral. So whatever it said on the page, I took that to be a kind of transparent representation of how reality really was. But secondly, I had no notion of how to tackle style, literary or otherwise. I didn't know what knowledge you needed to be able to analyze a piece of text and start to produce an interpretation or a criticism of what that text held within it. I didn't know what to look for, in other words. But I do recall responding to Anique's question with, what does what the text mean have to do with me? And I remember it to this day. It was a very, very long time ago. I can recall her laughing and saying everything. And I look back on that moment in many ways as a kind of time when there was a quiet revolution within me as a reader, I suppose, when a penny dropped that as a working class kid who left school with 2 GCSEs, I was bestowed with this privilege and this responsibility to read hard, if you like, to make meaning from the words in front of me. So I intended that to be a brief digression, that explanation then. So I better get on with the other thing that I was going to talk to you about. So going back to when I conduct observations, and it's not irrelevant, by the way, it's very much part of what I have in my mind when I go into classrooms to observe student teachers. So I go into schools, I conduct observations, and over the 9 years that I've been a teacher educator, I've been struck by how often I find myself asking those student teachers, who was the reader in your classroom today? Tell me, you made reference to the reader multiple times. In fact, they were present throughout the entire lesson. So who is the reader? And often I'll ask that question. Certainly before I carried out my research, I used to ask that question expecting a certain kind of response. Now I don't expect the response that I would have done in the past. I might have expected them to say previously, well, the reader is every pupil in the room. I've got 30 odd readers in front of me. What I've found actually, and what I've come to expect as an answer to that question, is uncertainty. So often the student teachers that I ask the question to will say, I've never really thought about that. I thought that was just something that we said in English lessons. What does the reader make of this? What do we think the reader understands by this use of this terminology or this technique? So that became, I suppose, a real focal area for me, and added to this area of, what does it mean to be a teacher of reading? That's what kind of spurred me on to carry out the research that I did. But I guess sticking with this idea of the reader, I wanted to spend some time really thinking about who this reader figure is in the classroom and what impact it potentially has on pupils in a classroom who are aware of this all-knowing, this all-seeing figure of the reader. And before today, we'd exchanged some emails and had a chance to catch up about what we were going to talk about today. And Steph got back to me with some really insightful and brilliant comments about the things I've written down that I wanted to talk about today. And she, in my eyes, quite rightly asked the question, well, the reader when? At what time? What are they doing? How do they change? To talk about the reader as a fixed entity and present that to students as this point of fixity that actually is outside of them as well, is really problematic. And for me, is something that I want to keep speaking about. I want to keep talking to teachers about that. So I guess a big focus for me in terms of answering this question is of what is a reader, is the role that every pupil plays. Taking myself back to that situation with Anique, similar to Matt's, being taught by somebody who invites a pupil to see themselves as capable of making meaning and articulating that meaning to their peers. But I think just before I end, I want to pick up on this point that's been mentioned a few times about knowledge. And I think very often it's too easy to dichotomize English lessons characterized by personal responses where the pupils are free to make up what they think a text means. Or on the other hand, so to dichotomize that by focusing or over-focusing on background knowledge, so that students are essentially given something akin to a history lesson. And for me, knowledge is very important. And somebody like Anique taught me lots of knowledge when I was in her lessons, but the knowledge she taught me very much pertained to literary study or reading. So she did show me how to focus on style. She did show me what to look out for and then invited me to talk about what I thought that might mean. So that's the area that I've become quite fixated on, I suppose, in terms of the question, what is a reader? It's somebody that can use the knowledge about texts, about language, about style, in order to then start developing some of their own interpretations. And again, I think that very much comes from my experiences observing student teachers in the classroom, where I see them encouraged to teach lots of background historical knowledge. And I don't consider that necessarily to be that fitting in a literature lesson. Just to end then, I wanted just to raise, again, in response to the question, the work of Louise Rosenblatt, who has come to be very influential for me personally. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Louise Rosenblatt's work, she published a seminal text in 1978 in which she suggested to us that essentially a poem is only ever a text until it meets its reader. And at the point when it meets its reader, it becomes a poem. So it is very much for Rosenblatt about the relationship between the reader and the words on the page that makes a meaning possible. So if you're interested in the work of Louise Rosenblatt, do go away. She's been very influential on the work of lots of people writing in the field. But I'd urge you to go away and have a look at it if you're interested in reader response theory. I think I've run over hugely there, but that's no surprise. Thanks for listening.
No, Joe, I could listen to you for days, honestly. I
Kind.
I love that flip on the who is the reader. That, like, not what is a reader, but who is the reader is such a powerful question. And highlights for me that the depth to, what we're looking to discuss here. But also I really like that. What did you say? A reader is someone that can use knowledge or apply knowledge to create their own interpretations. Yeah, a much more eloquent it's much more eloquent than me trying to make the same point earlier. So thank you for that. That's great. Okay, so we've finished the opening statements. Please do start to throw some questions in the chat. But while you're thinking about that, the one question that I want to throw back straight away to Steph and Joe to kind of get their sense of is the question about how we make our children better at what we've just spoken about. I'm really interested by that. And I wonder, you've each got very different kind of expertise to bring to bear on that. But Steph, I wonder if we can go to you first. What do you think about, in your experience, and what the three of us have outlined, how do we help make our children better at that?
I think it's really interesting, and we're sort of we don't want to fall down any kind of rabbit holes of false dichotomies between knowledge and skill or anything like that, which I think is often a danger of the debate in English. But I'm really interested in that in that element that you said about it has to be a curated journey. So as teachers or leaders of English, we have to make really difficult decisions about which text to teach and which conversations to have and which questions to ask and which essays to set or debates to have or whatever outcomes we're having in the classroom. And I'm really interested in that, what knowledge are we talking about? We're kind of agreeing that we don't like bolt-on historical context. In English, we seem to broadly agree with that. However, if you want to get the concept of something like, a gentleman, a Victorian gentleman, is kind of rooted in a certain time and place and set of values that are then connected to, Western Christian values, perhaps, that then are connected to, we know that we're going to have to teach in a practical sense in schools. We know we're going to have to teach a Victorian text at GCSE. So some concepts are going to be more useful than others in the curriculum journey, and schools have to be quite practical and realistic about, some people in shorthand have called it cultural capital, but when I was with my MA, not a doctorate, I haven't got there yet, but with my MA, I was looking at that question. I was looking at paper 2, basically. I was looking at language paper 2 and how to get more equitable access, what knowledge needs to be taught to give, students without, I'm using cultural capital as shorthand, but without the background knowledge to access those unseen texts. What's the best approach? What are the best things that you can do? And I think, unfortunately, often in English, things get a bit atomized. So some people will say, right, okay, well, one approach to that is we'll teach a lot of Victorian context. We'll teach concepts like the Victorian gentleman, or we'll teach them about, development of scientific discoveries and things like that. Some people will say, right, what we really need is Victorian, we're going to need a lot of tier 2 and 3 vocabulary, but that's what we're going to need. Some people say, oh, they need to know the literary form, so we need to get into syntax, we need to get into those really long Victorian sentences that have the verb at the end. We're going to teach them how to decode sentences. So I think for a knowledge rich, allegedly, not Gove being an allegedly knowledge rich having a knowledge rich approach, the unseen papers are a really strange way to go about it, because you're throwing an unseen Victorian text at students who haven't had a chance to read it before. So how are you supposed to build any kind of knowledge? And I don't know how. I'm not really answering the question, but I feel like there's a lot of interesting ways to get there. I don't think there's one simple answer, but I think the danger of going the literary route is that it turns into feature spotting and like, oh, well, I've spotted a metaphor, so I'll write about that. The danger of going the contextual route is that it ends up in, oh, well, I'll tell them what happened about the Poor Laws, and it ends up, historical facts. So somewhere in the middle of that is a selection process of finding what is the most useful knowledge, to help students, not just with that. I'm fixating on the unseen text in GCSE paper 2 because I think it's such a harsh choice, and I don't like that paper very much, but they don't even get any extra time and there's 2 texts. So yeah, so I guess, how do you equip students to meet those challenges? We've talked in quite a sort of, you know, idealistic way about what we want, but in practical terms, schools have only got so many hours of English a week. They've got certain GCSEs that they want their students to get to have their life chances, and they've got to make quite, you know, serious decisions about text and how to teach them. So yeah, less of an answer and probably more questions, but a few more ideas maybe.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because ultimately what you're talking about is the like tight versus loose, aren't you? You're talking about if we're planning to take children on a curated journey. Well, firstly, that's contested about what is the journey and the points on, you know, Eggleston's map that the metaphor he uses to talk about it, like which points of places of interest you take children to are different depending on what we're trying to do, aren't they? So that's really interesting. Thanks, Steph. Joe, what about you? You're kind of probably picking up partly where you left off, really talking about this, but really interested on your sense of how do we make our children better at reading?
Yeah, I guess the first thing that came to mind, which is something that I used, a piece of advice that I gave pupils when I was teaching, was to state the obvious quite often when they were looking at a piece of text, because I think I do this with PGCE students now, just in terms of getting them to think about denotive meaning and connotive meaning. That isn't something necessarily that literature undergraduates have studied on their undergraduate degree, and I've been surprised how often it's something of a surprise to them to encounter it for the first time. And we think then about how that could be applied to a text in a Key Stage 3 classroom. And the students quite quickly get to the point where they say, is that similar to comprehension and inference? And then you get into all kinds of questions like, well, which comes first, comprehension or inference? And it leads to a brilliant discussion with students. But I think they start to realise when, you know, you're on sort of the third activity in that session, they start to realise that stating the obvious, so comprehending what you see in front of you in a text, is harder than they've given it credit for. I think that's one thing I would say. And the other thing that I would say, just and listening to Steph, it made me think about myself as a practitioner in the past as an English teacher. And when Steph mentioned the Victorian gentleman idea, I guess for me, I look at it slightly differently, in the sense that I think I'm going to just draw upon Brian Cox's models of teaching English from 1988-89 momentarily. And to me, it starts to sound a little bit like we're wandering into the kind of what he might call the missionary role of English, or what we might call the missionary role of English, that English Lit has got this responsibility. And I am just focusing on literature for a minute because we focused on this figure of the Victorian gentleman, that it somehow it has to serve this purpose of edifying people about a thing, a time, a moment, a person in history, and that it befalls the English teacher to provide that sort of contextual background. And for me, I suppose I've always thought about it differently. So, you know, I would suggest perhaps that anything that the students need, the pupils need to know about that Victorian gentleman is already inside the text. It's already there. The context that they need to be able to respond to that text is already inside the text. So the words the character uses, their occupation, where they live, where they've travelled, the way that they relate to other characters, the peculiarities or idiosyncrasies of their speech, for instance, and that will help a reader start to become quite discerning about what they do with what they're presented with by an author. And what came to mind when I was thinking about what Steph was saying was I can remember studying Wuthering Heights, and also The Handmaid's Tale, and being taught by my English teacher that the narrators were unreliable, that Nellie Dean was unreliable, and it kind of blowing my mind that Bronte or Atwood would do that to their readers, and this suddenly just, it changed everything for me in a way. And what I really wanted to know about was what was it within the text that made it possible for other readers, I couldn't see it at that point, but other readers, and certainly my teacher, how they could establish that. What was it within the fabric of the text that enabled them to arrive at a point where they said things to me like, and I can still remember it, Nellie doesn't tell everything, or Nellie changes her mind. And suddenly that kind of, that suddenly made me feel like a reader, So I just think in terms of that knowledge question and the context question, I always believe that, and I would always give this advice to my students: what you need to know is always in the text. We don't really need to look anywhere else. That's a bit of a generalization. There may be times when you do need to, but I think by and large it's in the text.
And do you think that, I guess, do you think some are better equipped to find it in the text than others, and that's not just because of their teacher? You talk about the sort of missionary role, that kind of, do you think the social equity also comes from the text?
What I don't know exactly what you mean, Steph.
So as in, is that more accessible? If you're saying it's already in the text and it's a teacher's job to sort of give the keys to that, but then I'm just suggesting, are there other keys that are outside the classroom that are more in some people's possession than others?
Oh yeah, sorry. I think for me, the teacher still needs to be explicit in their teaching of context, but I think I would never assume that pupils within a classroom will necessarily have access to the context that lies within the text. So if the writer makes reference to the workhouse, for instance, in a Dickens novel, that is mentioned in the text, that it's the teacher's responsibility to spend some time explaining what that is, and not making an assumption that there'll be children in the room that know that everybody in the room knows what that is. But for me, I think the crucial bit is that it is actually mentioned in the text. So yeah, that's it for me. I suppose it's quite a subtle difference, but that's.
No, that makes sense. I wonder what you think. Sorry, Matt. I wonder what you think about something like symbolism, because I'm interested in. I work with Michael at Let's Think, and they had kind of key elements which sort of unlocked text, and symbolic reasoning is what they call it in their set of principles. And people talk about symbolism as a sort of central concept for English, but then something like a symbol of a snake, for example, is then rooted in Christianity and all of those sort of other references that go with that. So I wondered what you thought about a sort of set of references when you have a symbolic moment in a text. Then what knowledge needs to come from elsewhere, and how much is it the English teacher's responsibility to, for example, bring in the the Western Christian history of that? Or do you just say, oh, well, snakes bite you, that's good enough, that's enough to sort of them to work out the symbolism? Because everybody, well, maybe not everybody knows that snake, you need your science or geography knowledge to know what snakes do, or what they look like, or how they behave. So there's always some knowledge involved. If for any inference that you make, there's some sort of knowledge that you're bringing to the text. I suppose what I'm saying is, what I might bring is different to a year 7 who lives in a rural area or an urban area, or a different, not in England or whatever. We're all going to bring our own set of associations, and some more privileged than others.
Yeah, I guess I would answer by saying that I think sort of the cohesion across the whole text counts for an awful lot, doesn't it, in a situation like that? So, if you've got a pupil that says, well, snakes bite things, and you say, okay, so if I tell you that snakes have been used throughout history to represent this or this, and we look at other moments in the poem or the text, what do we think that might mean now? Are we rejecting that idea that I'm presenting you with, that actually the snake relates to the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. Are you accepting that, and can you make a connection? But I think you still need the teacher to introduce students to those concepts. It reminded me of a session I taught to English teachers from across Europe a few years ago. And there were a couple of teachers from Turkey, and I used the Lamb, Blake's The Lamb, and it was an eye opener for me, and a good kind of good insight, I suppose, into my own practice and the limitations of my own practice, where they said we totally don't get the lamb as Christ symbol. We just don't get it, and I guess I had underestimated, not underestimated, but kind of not considered enough what those readers brought to the text and what they couldn't see in the text that I could. And for me, it was just as simple as kind of bringing together some elements of the text and presenting that as a good argument for this really being about Jesus Christ. And they couldn't see that. So I guess in that moment, it became quite important that I listened to what their reading of the text was. At the same time as saying, but does that really make sense when you look at it? When you test that as a theory throughout the rest of the text, does it really stack up?
That's really fascinating. I think the thing that's standing out to me is that how nuanced this is. I think for me, when I listen to both of you speak, I used the word appreciation when I was sort of outlining my argument, and I feel like there's part of that lies in this. There's a difference between knowing and understanding a text versus appreciating it. There's very, very, like, again, nuanced difference, right? Like, I can know and understand the use of the serpent in Shakespeare, but to appreciate it is something totally different, isn't it? And I often use, when I think about this idea, I often talk about cars. I've know nothing about cars, but when I bought my most recent car, when the last one fell apart, it's got a flappy paddle gearbox. Now, I can know that it's got a flappy paddle gearbox, but I have no idea how to use it and don't. But if I did, I'd appreciate it, right? Or opening the bonnet and looking at all the tubes and stuff, like, I can look at it and know that it's there, but I don't appreciate it in the same way that our children, perhaps our readers looking or experiencing a poem for the first time, might know it or understand it from, like, what Joe was outlining about, like, the denotation, like, what does it denote? Like, well, I can tell you that, but appreciation is like another step, isn't it? And for me, that feels like that. What underpins that appreciation? Well, it's coming with, as Steph sort of outlined, experiences with other texts that you bring to bear and go, oh, this is a bit like this, or it's different to this, or I can see this here. And that's the knowledge that I think we're kind of talking about, that it can't be, you kind of go, right, I'm going to teach you this poem, and then I do a whole lesson beforehand where I teach you about, I don't know, the context of the poem. That actually the context to help you understand it, as Joe's saying, is hidden in the poem, but it's also hidden in the other poems on that map, on those places of interest that have taken you to that point, that you've come to it, and then the children appreciate it, the reader appreciates it in the way that we have kind of curated for them. And then on top of that, of course, they bring other knowledge. Readers aren't empty, are they, either? So they come with other things, but they come with like a shared body, I suppose, that we would acknowledge we would want children to come to know, to engage with it. Really, really interesting. I saw that we had a question in chat. So we said, I would like to ask, what is the role of tension in reading when students and teachers are accessing extra literary knowledge, which illustrates disparities rather than shared understanding of reading experiences of a text? Really interesting question. So what I think is being asked here, and feel free to correct me, is the role of tension in reading when students and teachers are accessing extra literary knowledge. So I think what we're talking about is that extra literary knowledge that I think I was referring to, wasn't it? Like religion, politics, philosophy, and things like that. What role does tension have in the reading of that when there's disparity between what children know and understand? And I think that comes to a point that Steph and Joe, you were both talking about. Do either of you want to come in? You're muted, Steph.
So I just leaned on the space button.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there can also be disparities between different teachers, aren't there, in classrooms and things. And I'm thinking about, Joe's brilliant example of the lamb meaning different things to people with different backgrounds. It's interesting how much, you've worked with Matt, Matt who works with Matt. You know how it is that people want to have a sort of equity of access. They want to have students having equal opportunities in the classroom. How much does it matter if one teacher knows more about a certain area, or one might be a Blake expert, one might be a 19th century whiz? Disparities could be between teachers as well as between the students in the class. And does that matter, or how do we address that? And I think some of the sort of things like, we have a resourced curriculum that's a jumping off point for people to develop, that tries to do that. I don't know if that's a good thing, or some people would argue that you should have complete autonomy from the teacher in the classroom. So, imagine a classroom that's got all of us three on the same corridor. What different experiences would they all have, and does that matter? And who's got the extra literary knowledge in that instance? So just seeing the second question about readers bringing their own lived experiences, I think that's really important, and to make connections with students' lives. But I think one of the risks of that is that you can also try to sort of pander to, it doesn't mean that all texts then have to be set in your hometown, because you need mirrors and windows. So I think I absolutely agree with that. But yeah, so I suppose that sort of sent me on a slight detour into disparities between teachers and the things that Joe's talking about. I think often people who want a lot of autonomy for teachers are thinking of teachers who maybe have been teaching for 10 or 20 years that have all of that to bring. But then newer teachers have got something else that's magical to bring. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. Really interesting. And I think moves nicely into what I'm sure Joe would like to come into in response to those questions as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it made me think about it going back to Rosenblatt's work and how that's been picked up by other people, and particularly John Gordon and Cheryl Hogue Smith, whose work I've become quite interested in, and they've sort of debated if you teach literature again, or you teach a text, and what you want to do is invite into the room different interpretations. For somebody like Cheryl Hogue Smith, she argues that having a multiplicity of often quite differing interpretations of a text can be really helpful for students' own thinking and the way that they arrive at interpretations, and perhaps rejecting some and coming up with reasons for why they've done that. And John Gordon makes an argument for including the reader, that figure, the reader that I referred to before, rather than trying to sort of remove them from the discussion in the classroom. Actually utilize that figure to say, well, the reader as this, if we sort of present them as a kind of authority figure, this slightly mystical figure that always has the right answers, to invite pupils to say, I don't really like that, and to sort of try and generate a certain amount of tension around that act of interpretation, and maybe work towards a point where the reader can start to be critical, not just to develop interpretations, but to develop the ability to be critical of other people's ideas, obviously in a respectful way. But I think that's what makes the English classroom so unique. For me, it gives you an opportunity as a teacher to really nurture that tension and see it as a strength of the subject itself. And I know when I was carrying out interviews for my research, one of the things that was a really lovely outcome, I suppose, of the interviews that I did was that many of the student English teachers that I spoke to talked about their own journey through English as a curriculum subject. And they focus very heavily on their A-level studies quite often. And one of the things that I found in the interviews was that they talked about experiencing other people's ways of life and the way in which that had helped them to understand different experiences that otherwise they would never have any grasp of, never have any understanding of, and that they believe that had enabled them to develop their powers of empathy, I suppose. And that was very moving for me to read that and to hear them say it in the interviews. But again, it strikes me as another example of the kind of tensions that we can bring into a classroom, that because we often use tension as a negative idea or a negative term, but actually within our subject, I think it's very productive and something that we should nurture as much as possible.
Lovely, thanks, Joe. And it feeds back nicely, actually. Your example of the symbolism, the lamb, illustrated the point wonderfully. Sometimes we need to consider our own vulnerability in terms of the knowledge that we don't have, and how students can lead interpretations based on their own expertise, which may take us onto a trajectory which we as experts have not considered. Yeah, really interesting. I wonder if I can, if I may, kind of take us on a slight detour, perhaps. I'm really interested, Joe, when you were talking there, and Steph as well, when you were talking through about the role we have as teachers in managing the collective reader. I think this point that's just been made here kind of speaks to this, which is that when we are, and it's a bit of well, I don't know how to describe it. It's very special to English teaching, isn't it? Managing a collective response to a text. And Joe, you've modelled it a number of times about saying kind of, well, does this challenge our perception of this text, or does this match what we had already agreed? That is a process of managing. I think it's a pedagogic one, isn't it? About managing like the collective reader. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Like, what role does the teacher have in managing that? What ideas or thoughts might you have for those attending today around, what role does the teacher have in managing that collective reader? Who I don't mind who comes in first.
Well, I would tend to say you would use other students in the room to kind of sense check. So, I think it's quite nice sometimes to be able to allow students to respond with each other. So I guess it's all about your questioning and how you think about approaching the poem if you want to open it up, and then having sort of paired talk before you feedback might be helpful, and you can circulate and kind of listen in to the discussions and think, well, like you've just done with us, what do I want to pick out to develop? And you can think, I've got 3 interesting ideas emerging in these discussions that I'm going to, take those ones forward and kind of curate first. And then that could also give some students perhaps a chance to sense check their ideas with each other. Well, I was thinking this, well, I was thinking that. A lamb didn't mean that to me. A lamb meant this to me. So there's a bit of, I would say there's a peer role there. And then the word that I always use when I was thinking about it, which actually you've used on me, Matt, but I won't take offence, is that's interesting. That's interesting. When I'm working out, like, does that actually make sense, or is that a valid? Yeah, I mean, obviously, I started off all responses are valid because I was just so pleased when I was training that anyone answered any of my questions. I was like, yes, brilliant answer. Someone's answered one of my questions. Hooray! And then as you get a bit more experience, you get a bit more discerning, don't you, about curating your answers and sort of what's going to be a more fruitful and interesting discussion. But yeah, interesting with a bit of chin always buys you a bit of time when you're thinking about what you want to pick up on. But I think, I sort of really learned early on that there were no wrong answers in English, but like sometimes there are, and it's okay to say that. And I still feel quite uncomfortable with that because I value the individual's interpretation so much. But also in practical terms, you've only got so long in a lesson, and there's content. I mean, I hate to be, the practical one, but there's content in the national curriculum, and there's exams at the end of it, and there's stuff you have to sort of, it's lovely stuff, but you have to sort of get through it as well. I hate to describe it like that, but there is an element of content management. You can have conversations all day long, but there are 15 poems. There are 15 poems on the anthology. I think it's too many, but so there are some practicalities, like how long the lesson is, how many kids you've got in the class. If they're all going to say something and you've got a 60-minute lesson, they've got 2 minutes each. So, not everyone can have the stage, can they? So your behaviour management's also, before any of that, your behaviour management's got to be excellent. And then you've got to have some really, really high quality sort of questioning skills as well, which Matt has modelled for us beautifully. Interesting.
I am
I'm
now
only teasing, I'm only teasing.
I'm now overly concerned about my language and will,
No, I'm only messing. Sorry.
What I thought was really good about what you said, Steph, was that you sort of, for me, were outlining that, and it kind of implicitly, but I think other people have, certainly some of the comments have made this explicitly, that as a teacher that would successfully manage that collective reader, the teacher themselves has to position themselves in a space of vulnerability, because actually what you are doing is opening up as Joe has done, I think, kind of going, well, what's our shared position on this, and allowing that space to be one where, I remember as a student teacher being preoccupied with what the right answer was for fear that everyone would get it wrong or I'd be found out to not have the right answer. That actually there is the joy in going into things with, well, I wonder what the answer to this could be. Like it could be lots of different things. But I also recognize that sits on one of the points that I made about expert blindness. Like I could go into that comfortably with certain poems because I feel like I know them very well. Whereas there's other poems that I might go into it and feel completely out of my depth and not willing or wanting to have that discussion at all. So I was really caught by what you said there. Joe, what do you think? If you could come in on that point about what role does the teacher have in managing that collective reader?
I think the teacher plays a really important one. Actually, they're vital in that kind of situation where it's possible for students to spin off in so many different directions that the interpretation that might write down in an essay or an exam is wrong, actually. And Steph mentioned the notion of right and wrong answers, and I do say to students, there may not be any such thing as the right answer in English Lit, but there definitely is a wrong answer. And the way that you can arrive at the wrong answer is by ignoring the text. And I think, so in terms of the teacher's job in sort of managing a collective reader response, if you can teach pupils to always go back to the text and make sure that they can demonstrate how their interpretations arise from what they've read on the page, then I don't believe there is such a thing as a wrong answer if it's really clear that they've done that. I mean, it also made me think of many years ago teaching Death of the Salesman, and a student in my class said something along the lines of, but aren't we all just really glad when Willy Loman dies? And in that moment, I thought, I'm a terrible English teacher because I've completely failed to teach them about modern tragedy. And moments in the play when it was clear that Arthur Miller was, Willy Loman is presented to us as hugely frustrating. But by the end of the play, we all feel the absolute tragedy of what he does. And I've missed opportunities to make that really clear to students along the way of our reading. And I think, going back to the point I made before about the teacher's role in teaching knowledge, and that the knowledge that they need resides within the text. Again, I'm just going to kind of touchstone that really. And in a situation like that, I wouldn't go away and research modern American tragedy. But as the subject specialist teacher in the room, I can direct students to key moments in the play, using Death of a Salesman as an example, where it's clear that what Miller is doing is manipulating his audience to feel that sense of waste and that tragedy by the end of the play. It's all in there. So I think it's a similar kind of idea to the one I mentioned before related to knowledge and context, but that for me is the role that the teacher plays in managing that collective readership.
Yeah, I would totally agree about sending them back to the text, because 9 times out of 10, when you go, oh, where did you find that? What made you say that? Can you show me where in the text you found that? And then 9 times out of 10, then, oh, actually, yeah, it does work. And then, of course, they're practicing, they're finding their evidence, which is
Exactly. Exactly. I can remember teaching Tessa the D'Urbervilles for A-level many years ago, and students saying, well, I think she just had she had a really terrible childhood. And you'd say, where's that? Because I thought we met her in her teens. And they'd go, oh, it's not in the book, but obviously she had a terrible childhood. So I'm going to interpret everything that happens thereafter in those terms. And that's where you say, no, you mustn't do that. You really mustn't do that. You're on a hide into nothing and nowhere if you do.
Great. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the chat? Great. As teachers, how best do you think we can encourage students wider reading outside of the classroom? Wow, what an important question.
I think I'd go back to the point that Bianca made earlier in the chat, actually, about making connections to students' lives and trying to convince young people that the things that they're interested in will make a difference to their reading, and that it may not be that the books that we study in school necessarily have immediate appeal to them, but there will be lots of things that they do have interest in. And I don't know whether that's something that's become less likely. I mean, Steph and Matt, you would know more than that, because I've not taught for 9 years, but in schools. But yeah, I think really appealing to students' lives and their interests is key.
I think for me, I think that question, I think about it with my own children, actually, that there is such a pressure sometimes, I think, to find all books, all literature of the same level of interest, when actually, I don't, if I'm watching the TV and it's boring, I change the channel. But often with books, children just haven't necessarily been equipped with the confidence to put something down and go, you know what, I've read a chapter of this. It's not ticking any boxes for me. I'd rather read this or read that. And I can see it in my own reading. Like I could feel a little embarrassed to kind of reel off the kind of historic fiction I like to read as trash reading, just to kind of get through. But it's, I found that's the thing, that's my thing that I'll turn to when I'm like, just want to read something and escape for a while. That's what I kind of resort to. So I think it's that, isn't it? Once a reader finds what they're interested in reading, that can be the hook that encourages them outside of the classroom, in my experience. Steph, I don't know about your own thoughts.
I would agree. I think it's about the conversations. I think it's about knowing your kids really well, so you might even know your form group better than some of your English classes, especially if some of your year 11 classes might be more focused on Macbeth. I think a lot of it is about those kind of incidental conversations that you might have with or about your students who and to show interest in their interest that might not, but you even sort of did yourself down and said, oh, I read trash fiction, like I wouldn't even call it that. There's lots of different types of texts, and particularly some of the students that I taught and my own kids had some really amazing video games that they played. And I think it's easy to be dismissive of video games, but they've got really rich characterization and narratives. I've had kids like being bits when they finished a video game because they've lost the character. It's like the end of a film or a book. So I think kind of being open to different types of narrative and engaging with them on a level about that, and asking questions. Oh, right, so what's that character like in that game? Or they might know vocabulary like ricochet from a shooting game or something. That there's opportunities everywhere. So I would say know your students, and it's about the kind of incidental conversations and recommendations, and be like, oh, I'm reading this at the moment. Oh, I love this book, it's about such and such. And they'll be like, oh, you're such a geek, you're always reading. But actually, you showing your own passion is important. And I think also get writers in, because we had Alex Wheatle come in pretty much every year. He became our regular, And they see a living, breathing writer, and they're like, oh wow, you know, not all writers are sort of dead white men, and they get really excited that there's an actual living writer. And you make a living out of that. Poets, you know. So yeah, I would say writer visits are pretty powerful, because they'll all be like, oh, he's much cooler than you, and he wrote a book. So that helps. Just generally the comparative cool factor, that they don't have to be cool, but it helps. And any events, you know, getting out to see like writers are living people, I think is quite important. Live plays and things, and modern plays, school trips. I know it's all money and staffing, but I guess things in the real world, lived experience, slam poetry, storytellers, that type of thing brings it alive, doesn't it?
Thanks, Steph. Louise has come in with a question, an Ofsted related question, I'm afraid, right close to the end of the session. I've recently been involved in a number of Ofsted inspections and have been asked in each to gather a group of quote unquote good readers. This has led to a number of discussions about what a good reader is. The requests were made during English meetings rather than reading meetings. What is your view on this? Goodness.
I mean, did you ask them first of all to what do they mean by a good reader? Or I mean, it's a bit scary to ask Ofsted inspectors anything. Did you ask them, Louise, what their definition was?
So I'm just trying to unmute myself.
Hi, Louise.
Hi. I ended up taking students in with their books and with reasons why we thought they were good readers on post-it notes in front of the books for the inspectors, because I think their original thought was that they would have students in just to read to them. But that didn't necessarily mean that because they could read the words on the page, they could understand what was being said. If it was in a reading meeting, it was different. I just think there's more than one way to be a good reader, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it could be somebody who maybe couldn't read when they got there in year 7, and now they you know, a decoding or a decoding question, a fluency question, a comprehension question, you know, an appreciation question, like Matt was saying earlier. So yeah, I mean, it would be good to get their definition if there is one. But I love the idea of the students coming in with the post-it notes as to why they are, because there's lots of good reasons as to what good could be. It sounds like you've dealt with it really well.
Yeah, you know, you just wonder sometimes, oh, should I have done this differently as well? But it was good to try to encourage the students to think why or what they were doing that was really good. I apologize, my camera isn't working, it just keeps flicking on and off.
I guess what I don't like is the sort of flip side of that is all the kids who are back in the classroom thinking that they're not a good reader, you know, that hopefully they didn't know that's what they
they didn't know.
Yeah, you know, there's that definition, because once you sort of feel yourself defined as something, it can be, you know, like that, oh, I'm not good at maths thing, you know, it can be quite limiting. Yeah, sounds like you dealt with it brilliantly, Louise.
I agree, and I think unfortunately, you know, stating the obvious, I think Ofsted's view of what makes a reader, I mean, our discussion tonight is it's unpacked so many things, and we don't necessarily have the answers to the main question. You know, we've got lots and lots and lots of answers to that one question. Whether it's helped us, you know, understand what the question is really about and what actually is a reader is another thing altogether. So the fact that Ofsted can come in and ask of you, you know, select those that you think are good readers, is hugely problematic. And I think we know that about, you know, so many aspects of Ofsted and inspections, but we know that Ofsted define a good reader according to certain models, like the Hoover and Goff model, simple view of reading. And we know that through the reading framework, there are some very particular, very useful, but very particular perspectives on what reading is. And I suspect the fluency element was something that they were checking in having students read aloud. But, you know, it doesn't really do it justice in a sense, does it? Because, and I know we were recently Ofsteded, and I know this is not an exceptional situation, but we didn't have any specialists inspecting us during our inspection. And at times like that, you think, well, you're coming in and you're making a judgment about what a good reader is, but you don't necessarily have the disciplinary background to make that judgment. So it sounds to me like you did a cracking job in a very, very challenging set of circumstances, Louise.
Thank you.
I mean, it
Sorry,
might be
go on,
a big one to finish on, but I suppose I was thinking of earlier on when you were talking about you know, things that come naturally, and I was thinking about Geary and biologically primary and secondary knowledge and stories. You were talking about Mary Myatt and stories, that listening to stories and hearing stories is not you know, not a million miles away from that. And you know, I wondered as a maybe it's a bit late to get into it, but as a thought, what happens if you have got students who are at that stage where they are not decoding or they aren't fluent readers, but you want them to access as wide a range of stories as possible and to access rich texts, because that's something I think a lot of schools battle with, because they do have students coming in with struggling with low reading ages and chronological reading ages and so on. Do people have any solutions to that as to how to ensure a sort of rich diet of literature when students' sort of understanding might be up here, but their decoding level is down here?
Oh, Steph, you've pulled that right out of the bag at the last minute.
We'll leave that as the cliffhanger for the next one.
We might have to. I'm looking at the clock and thinking we've got about 2 minutes of the session left. So, Joe, unless you can answer that in 30 seconds, we might have to be what is a reader anyway, part 2.
Part 2, yeah, we'll
on.
do EastEnders noises at the end and just
I
build it up.
I think that's a better response. Yeah, better idea. But Bianca's just put short extracts, and that was one of the things that I was thinking of actually. I'm not sure if it'd always work, but short extracts. But then when you mentioned students that struggle to decode, that's what stopped me from responding, because I was thinking that's a slightly different thing. So I think I'd need a bit more time to think about that one.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It certainly sounds like one we should come back to. I think the point that I'd finish on, I think, listening to like rereading Julie's comment then about like encouraging students to read more widely outside of the classroom. I know that from my personal experience, actually something that I haven't often done in the past, but make a conscious effort to do much more of now, is talk to the children in pupil voice groups and ask them those questions outside of a lesson, and talk to them to really understand what their perspectives are. And it's so enlightening and gives me such a strong sense of what I can do better in schools that I work in. It's really fascinating, and I would strongly encourage you to do that. Okay, we've got about a minute left, Becky. Is there anything that you'd like to say to close the session today?
Yes, I'd like to say thank you. This has been a really sort of nourishing session, you know, to hear such personal accounts of your own sort of stories as readers, as well as your deep expert knowledge of, you know, of the so fortunate young people that you work with and the teachers that you train. So thank you for giving of your ideas and your knowledge so generously. It is really appreciated. And yes, part 2 I think might have to come. So more and on. So thank you again so much to Steph and Joe and Matt, and to all of you for joining us. And if you've booked on to the interview with Carol Atherton and Bob Eagleston, that's happening in about 15 minutes. So I might see some more of you again shortly. So thank you so much, and see you all soon. Bye. Thank you.